The stars had belonged to the Vethkai for 12,000 years. In all that time, across all the countless worlds they had conquered, not a single species had ever stopped them. Not one. The Vethkai hegemony was eternal. It was absolute. It was the natural order of the universe, as certain as gravity and as old as the stars themselves. High Arbiter Seleth Vorantis stood at the observation window of his flagship, the Undying Throne, and watched the endless darkness of space stretch before him. He was ancient by any measure. His pale gray skin had grown thin with age, and the bony ridges along his skull had turned from deep purple to almost white. But his four eyes remained sharp, and his mind remained sharper still. Behind him, the bridge of the Undying Throne hummed with quiet activity. Hundreds of lesser Vethkai worked at their stations, monitoring the ship's living systems, tracking the movements of the fleet, processing the endless stream of data that flowed through the hegemony's vast network. The ship itself was alive. Like all Vethkai warships, the Undying Throne had been grown rather than built. Its hull was made of biocrystalline material, a substance that was part metal, part organic tissue, and part something else entirely. The walls pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of some great beast. Veins of glowing fluid ran through every surface, carrying nutrients and energy to every part of the vessel. It was beautiful. It was terrible. It was a perfect expression of Vethkai superiority. Seleth turned from the window and walked slowly across the bridge. His long robes dragged behind him, and the crew members he passed lowered their heads in respect. None dared to meet his gaze. To look directly at a High Arbiter was forbidden. It suggested equality, and there was no equality in the hegemony. There was only hierarchy, only power, only the eternal truth that some species were born to rule and others were born to serve. A junior officer approached him, keeping his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. High Arbiter, the analysis of the primitive signals is complete. Seleth stopped walking. Show me. The officer made a gesture, and a holographic display appeared in the air before them. It showed a small blue planet, third from its yellow sun, located on the very edge of the Orion Spur. The planet was covered in water and patches of green and brown land. Swirling white clouds drifted across its surface. The species calls itself human, the officer explained. They have only recently discovered faster-than-light travel. Their technology is crude. Their civilization is fragmented into multiple competing nations. They have no unified government, no central military command, and no experience with interstellar warfare. Seleth studied the image of the blue world. It looked fragile, vulnerable, like a fruit waiting to be plucked. How many of them are there, he asked. Approximately 12 billion on their homeworld. Another 3 billion spread across a handful of nearby colonies. Total population of 15 billion. Seleth made a sound that might have been a laugh. 15 billion. The hegemony controlled trillions. The subjugated chorus alone numbered in the hundreds of trillions. Countless species that had been conquered and broken and put to work serving their Vethkai masters. Their military strength, Seleth asked, minimal. They possess a small fleet of warships, perhaps 2,000 vessels. Their weapons are primitive kinetic systems and basic nuclear warheads. Their shields are non-existent. Their understanding of biocrystalline technology is zero. The officer paused, and something that might have been amusement crossed his face. High Arbiter, our seers have calculated that the conquest will take 6 rotations, perhaps less. The humans will offer no meaningful resistance. Seleth nodded slowly. This was how it always went. A new species was discovered, their weakness was assessed, and then the hegemony moved in to claim what was rightfully theirs. It had happened thousands of times before. It would happen thousands of times again. The strong consumed the weak. This was the fundamental law of the universe. Summon Fleet Commander Vorath, Seleth ordered. Inform him that I am issuing a decree of annexation for the human territory. He will take 40,000 ships and bring these creatures into the subjugated chorus. The officer bowed deeply. It will be done, High Arbiter. Shall we send the traditional message of surrender first? Offer them the chance to submit peacefully? Seleth considered this for a moment. In ancient times, the Vethkai had sometimes offered their prey a choice: surrender and be enslaved, or resist and be destroyed. It was considered sporting, honorable even, but those traditions had faded over the millennia. The Vethkai had grown comfortable in their power. They had stopped seeing other species as worthy of even the smallest courtesies. "No," Seleth said finally. "Prey does not deserve words. Let our weapons speak for us." The officer bowed again and hurried away to carry out his orders. Seleth returned to the observation window and stared out at the stars. Somewhere out there, on that small blue world, 15 billion humans were going about their lives. They were eating and sleeping and working and loving. They were building things and dreaming dreams and making plans for their futures. They had no idea what was coming. Seleth felt nothing at the thought. No guilt, no hesitation, no doubt. Why should he? The humans were inferior. They existed only to serve. Their dreams were meaningless, their hopes were worthless, and their futures belonged to the hegemony. This was simply how the universe worked. 3 days later, the invasion fleet assembled. 40,000 warships gathered in the darkness beyond the hegemony's core worlds. They were magnificent vessels, each one a masterpiece of biocrystalline engineering. The largest were dreadnoughts, 3 kilometers long, bristling with organic weapon systems that could crack planets open like eggs. The smallest were fast attack cruisers, sleek and deadly, designed to hunt down fleeing prey and finish them off. Fleet Commander Voreth stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Hunger, and reviewed his orders. He was younger than High Arbiter Seleth, but he was no less proud. He had led 100 conquests, destroyed 1,000 worlds, and added dozens of species to the subjugated chorus. His name was spoken with fear across half the galaxy. And now he had been given the honor of bringing humanity to heel. "Set course for the human territory," Voreth commanded. "We will strike their outermost colony first. Let them see what happens to those who exist outside the hegemony's protection." The fleet began to move. 40,000 ships activated their jump drives, tearing holes in the fabric of space and vanishing into the strange dimension that allowed faster-than-light travel. They crossed dozens of light years in moments, emerging from hyperspace in a perfectly coordinated formation. Before them lay the human colony of New Valencia. It was a young world only recently settled. The planet was covered in thick forests and deep blue oceans. A few million humans lived there, mostly farmers and miners, and the support workers who kept the colony running. They had a small defense force, a handful of patrol ships and orbital stations, nothing that could possibly threaten a Vethkai war fleet. Voreth studied the planet on his display and felt a familiar thrill of anticipation. The hunt was about to begin. "Signal the fleet," he ordered. "Standard annexation protocol. Destroy their orbital defenses, then begin landing troops. I want the population centers secured within 2 rotations." His officers moved to obey, but before the order could be sent, something strange happened. An alert sounded on the tactical display. One of the sensor operators looked up with confusion on his face. "Commander, I'm detecting unusual activity from the human orbital platforms." "Unusual how?" "They appear to be charging weapons, Commander." Voreth blinked. This was unexpected. Most species, when faced with an overwhelming force, chose to surrender or flee. Very few were foolish enough to actually fight. "How charming," he said dryly. "The prey has teeth. Let them fire their pathetic weapons. It will make no difference." He watched as the human orbital platforms opened fire. Bright flashes appeared across the tactical display as kinetic projectiles were launched toward the Vethkai fleet. Voreth smiled. Kinetic weapons. How primitive. How utterly useless against Vethkai shields. The smile faded when the first projectile hit. It struck the cruiser, Whisper of Doom, directly amidships. The shield, which had been designed to deflect energy weapons, did nothing to stop the tungsten slug traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The projectile punched through the shield as if it wasn't there, tore through the biocrystalline hull, and exited out the other side. The Whisper of Doom broke apart in a shower of crystalline fragments and burning organic matter. For a moment, no one on the bridge of the Eternal Hunger spoke. They simply stared at their displays in shock. This was impossible. This did not happen. Vethkai warships did not die to primitive kinetic weapons. They just didn't. Then the second volley hit. and the third, and the fourth. Ships began dying throughout the fleet. Cruisers and destroyers and even a few smaller dreadnoughts were torn apart by the human weapons. The elegant formations that the Vethkai had maintained for millennia dissolved into chaos as captains desperately tried to maneuver their vessels out of the line of fire. Vorath gripped the railing of his command platform, his four eyes wide with disbelief. "This is impossible," he whispered. Our shields should stop them." One of his officers, a young tactical analyst, spoke up with a trembling voice. "Commander, the humans, they appear to have calibrated their weapons specifically to bypass our shield frequencies. The projectiles are too dense, too fast. Our shields were never designed to stop this kind of attack." "How?" Vorath demanded. "How could they possibly know our shield frequencies?" No one had an answer. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted less than an hour. The human orbital platforms continued their relentless barrage, and the Vethkai fleet, caught completely off guard, suffered losses it had never experienced in thousands of years of warfare. When it was over, nearly 1,000 Vethkai ships had been destroyed or crippled. The rest of the fleet retreated in disarray, jumping back to hyperspace and fleeing toward hegemony territory. Fleet Commander Vorath stood alone on his bridge, surrounded by the bodies of officers who had died when a human projectile had grazed the eternal hunger. He stared at the tactical display, which showed the human colony world still intact, still defiant. For the first time in his long life, he had tasted defeat. On the planet below, the humans watched the alien fleet retreat. In the command center of New Valencia's main settlement, men and women cheered and embraced each other. They had won. Against all odds, against an enemy that had conquered half the galaxy, they had won. Commander Thessa Okoye of the Terran Defense Force did not join the celebration. She stood apart, studying the data from the battle, her dark eyes thoughtful. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "This was just their vanguard. When they realize what happened here, they'll send everything they have." Her second-in-command, a young officer named Torres, looked at her with concern. "Do you think we can stop them?" Okoye was silent for a long moment. Then she turned to face him, and there was something hard and determined in her expression. "We've been preparing for this for 20 years, she said, "ever since we captured that first probe and realized what was out there. We've studied them. We've learned their weaknesses. We've built weapons specifically designed to kill them." She looked out the window at the stars, at the vast darkness where an ancient empire was reeling from its first defeat in millennia. "They thought they were untouchable," she said. "They thought we were prey. They were wrong." Far away in the heart of the hegemony, High Arbiter Seleth Varantis received the news of the defeat. He sat in his private chambers aboard the undying throne, surrounded by luxury that had been plundered from 1,000 conquered worlds. Tapestries woven by extinct species hung on the walls. Sculptures carved by races that no longer existed decorated every surface. It was a monument to the hegemony's power, a reminder that the Vethkai always won. And now, for the first time, they had lost. Seleth read the report again, certain that there must be some mistake. Nearly 1,000 ships destroyed. Fleet Commander Vorath in retreat. A primitive species with crude technology had somehow managed to bloody the most powerful military force in the galaxy. Impossible. Utterly impossible. And yet the evidence was undeniable. Seleth set the report aside and rose from his chair. He walked slowly to the window and stared out at the stars that his people had ruled for 12,000 years. The humans had surprised him. They had hurt him, but they had not defeated him. Not yet. Not ever. He would summon the full might of the hegemony's core fleet. He would gather every warship under his command, every warrior in his armies, every weapon in his arsenals. He would descend upon the human worlds like a storm of fire and death, and he would teach them what happened to prey that dared to bite back. The humans had won a battle, but they would not win the war. No one ever did. No one ever could. The hegemony was eternal. The hegemony was absolute, and the hegemony would have its revenge. Seleth turned from the window and began issuing orders. The real war was about to begin. The news of New Valencia spread across human space like wildfire. Within hours, every colony, every space station, every ship in the Terran fleet knew what had happened. The aliens had come, the aliens had attacked, and humanity had fought back, and won. In the great cities of Earth, people gathered in the streets to watch the footage. They saw the alien ships arriving, thousands of them, their hulls glowing with strange lights. They saw the orbital platforms opening fire, the bright streaks of kinetic rounds racing through the void. They saw the enemy vessels breaking apart, burning, dying. Some people cheered, others wept. Many simply stood in silence, trying to understand what it meant. Humanity was no longer alone in the universe, and the universe, it seemed, was not friendly. Commander Thessa Okoye had no time for celebration. Even as the people of New Valencia danced in the streets, she was already preparing for what came next. She stood in the underground command center beneath the colony's capital city, surrounded by screens and displays that showed every piece of information they had gathered about the enemy. The Vethkai. That was what they called themselves. An ancient species that had ruled their part of the galaxy for 12,000 years. An empire built on conquest and slavery. A force that had never been stopped. Until now. "They'll be back," she said to the assembled officers. "And when they come back, they won't make the same mistakes." Colonel Marcus Webb, her chief tactical officer, nodded grimly. "We caught them off guard. They weren't expecting resistance. Next time, they'll be ready for us." "How long do we have?" asked Lieutenant Torres. Okoye pulled up a star chart on the main display. "Based on the trajectory of their retreat, they're heading back to their staging area. If they regroup and launch an immediate counterattack, they could be back here in 2 to 3 weeks. 2 weeks, someone muttered. "That's not much time." "No," Okoye agreed. "It's not, which is why we need to evacuate the civilian population immediately. Get everyone off our world who can't fight. Send them deeper into human territory." "And us?" Torres asked. "What do we do?" Okoye turned to face him. Her expression was calm, but there was fire in her eyes. "We stay, we fight, we make them pay for every kilometer they take." The evacuation began the next day. Transports landed on New Valencia in an endless stream, loading civilians and carrying them to safety. Families said goodbye to their homes, not knowing if they would ever see them again. Children cried as they were hurried onto ships. Old people looked back at the world they had helped to build, their faces filled with sorrow. But even as the civilians left, soldiers arrived, thousands of them, transported from Earth and the other colonies. They came with weapons and armor and vehicles, everything humanity had built in preparation for this day. Because the truth was, humanity had been preparing for a long time. 23 years ago, a Vethkai probe had entered the solar system. It was a small thing, unmanned, designed to scout and observe. It had been watching Earth for nearly a month before human scientists detected it. The governments of Earth had faced a choice. They could ignore the probe and hope that whoever sent it was friendly, or they could capture it and learn everything they could about the species that had built it. They chose to learn. The probe was brought down carefully using a combination of EMP bursts and precision missiles. It was transported to a secret facility in the mountains of Switzerland, where the greatest minds on Earth spent years taking it apart, studying every component, analyzing every piece of data stored in its memory banks. What they found terrified them. The probe contained records of the Vethkai hegemony, histories of conquest, catalogs of subjugated species, images of worlds that had been stripped bare, populations that had been enslaved, civilizations that had been erased from existence. The Vethkai did not negotiate, they did not trade, they did not make peace. They conquered. That was all they did. That was all they had ever done. And eventually they would come for Earth. The world's leaders held an emergency summit. For the first time in human history, every nation agreed on something. They would prepare, they would build, they would be ready. The project was given the code name Project Sentinel. On the surface, nothing changed. Nations continued to argue and compete. Politics continued as usual. The public remained blissfully unaware of what lurked in the darkness between the stars. But beneath the surface, humanity transformed itself. Secret shipyards were constructed in the asteroid belts and beneath the frozen moons of the outer solar system. New weapons were developed, designed specifically to counter Vethkai technology. Millions of soldiers were trained in tactics meant to fight an enemy from the stars. The kinetic accelerators were the most important development. Human scientists had studied the Vethkai shields and found their weakness. The shields were designed to deflect energy weapons, the kind of weapons that most advanced species used, but they were nearly useless against solid projectiles traveling at extreme speeds. Physics didn't care how advanced you were. A chunk of tungsten moving at a significant fraction of light speed would punch through almost anything. So humanity built guns. Really, really big guns. The orbital defense platforms around every human colony were equipped with massive kinetic accelerators, weapons that could launch tungsten rods with enough force to crack open a mountain. Against Vethkai shields, they were devastating, and that was just the beginning. Commander Okoye had been part of Project Sentinel from the start. She had helped design the tactics, train the soldiers, and test the weapons. She had dedicated her entire adult life to preparing for this war. Now the war had arrived, and she intended to win it. 2 weeks after the first battle, the Vethkai returned to New Valencia. This time they sent 5,000 ships. Not the full might of the hegemony, but enough to crush a single colony world. Or so they thought. Fleet Commander Vorath had been stripped of his rank after the disaster of the first attack. His replacement was a grim-faced veteran named Admiral Kethos, who had spent centuries putting down rebellions and conquering stubborn species. He did not underestimate his enemies. "Launch fighter screens first," Kethos ordered as his fleet emerged from hyperspace. "I want a full sensor sweep before we commit the main force. These humans are cunning. We must be cautious." The fighters spread out across the system, scanning everything. They found the orbital platforms, just as they had been before. They found the human colony on the planet's surface. They found a small defensive fleet in orbit, perhaps 100 vessels. Nothing that could stop 5,000 warships. "Interesting," Kethos mused, studying the tactical display. "They have reinforced their orbital defenses, and their fleet is larger than before. But still nowhere near enough to challenge us." "Should we attack, Admiral?" his second-in-command asked. Kethos considered the question. Part of him wanted to rush in, to avenge the humiliation of the first battle. But he was old and experienced, and he had learned patience over the centuries. "No," he said finally. "We will advance slowly, keep our shields at maximum power, adjust the frequencies to better deflect kinetic impacts. We will not be caught off guard again." The Vethkai fleet moved forward in a careful formation, shields glowing bright against the darkness of space. This time, they were ready, or so they thought. On the planet below, Commander Okoye watched the enemy approach. She stood in the command center, surrounded by her officers, her eyes fixed on the tactical display. "They're being cautious," Torres observed, "moving slowly, keeping their shields up." "Smart," Okoye admitted. "They learned from the first battle. They've adjusted their shield frequencies. Our kinetic rounds won't be as effective this time." "So what do we do?" Okoye smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "We show them what else we've learned." She opened a communication channel to the orbital platforms. "All stations, this is Commander Okoye. Switch to secondary weapons, nuclear-tipped missiles. Target their engine sections." Across the system, the orbital platforms changed their targeting. The kinetic accelerators fell silent, and missile tubes opened instead. Thousands of missiles launched simultaneously, racing toward the Vethkai fleet on trails of fire. Admiral Kethos saw them coming and felt a moment of contempt. Missiles? The humans thought missiles would stop them? Vethkai point defense systems could shoot down missiles by the thousands. "Destroy them," he ordered casually, "then proceed with the attack." The Vethkai ships opened fire, filling the space around them with defensive fire. Missiles exploded by the hundreds, filling the void with nuclear fire. But there were too many of them. The humans had launched nearly 10,000 missiles, far more than the Vethkai point defense systems could handle. And these were not ordinary missiles. They were smart weapons, capable of evading fire, changing course, working together to overwhelm their targets. The first missiles reached the Vethkai fleet. They didn't try to penetrate the shields. Instead, they targeted the gaps, the engine sections, the weapon ports, the tiny vulnerabilities that existed in any ship, no matter how well protected. The nuclear warheads detonated. Vethkai ships began to die again. Admiral Kethos gripped the arms of his command chair, his 4 eyes wide with shock. This is impossible. They were supposed to be primitives. But the humans were far from primitive. They had simply hidden their true capabilities. They had let the Vethkai underestimate them. And now they were making the enemy pay for that arrogance. The battle raged for hours. The Vethkai pushed forward, taking terrible losses but determined to reach the planet. The humans fought back with everything they had, using every weapon, every tactic, every trick they could devise. And then, when the Vethkai fleet was fully committed, the trap was sprung. 100 human warships emerged from hiding places throughout the system. They had been waiting in the shadows of asteroids and the rings of gas giants, their engines cold, their systems silent. Now they came to life, swooping in behind the Vethkai fleet. They were small ships, fast and maneuverable. Each one carried a single weapon, a massive kinetic accelerator, the largest that human engineers could build. They opened fire at point-blank range. The shots hit the Vethkai ships from behind, where their shields were weakest. Tungsten rounds punched through hulls, tore through vital systems, and turned proud warships into drifting wreckage. Admiral Kethos watched his fleet die around him. He had walked into an ambush, and now he was paying the price. "Retreat!" he shouted into the communication system. "All ships, retreat! Fall back to the rally point." The surviving Vethkai ships turned and fled, jumping into hyperspace as fast as their drives could carry them. They left behind nearly 2,000 vessels, destroyed or crippled, the largest loss the hegemony had suffered in thousands of years. On the planet below, the humans cheered once again, but Commander Okoye did not celebrate. She knew this was still just the beginning. Far away in the heart of the hegemony, High Arbiter Seleth Varantis received the report of the second defeat. He sat alone in his chambers, the holographic display flickering before him. 2,000 ships lost, an admiral in disgrace, a primitive species that continued to resist. Seleth's hands trembled as he read the details. Not with fear, never with fear. He trembled with rage. How dare they? How dare these insects these vermin, these nothing creatures challenge the might of the hegemony? Did they not understand who they were fighting? Did they not know that resistance was futile, that their destruction was inevitable, that they could only delay the unavoidable? He would crush them. He would burn their worlds to ash and grind their bones to dust. He would erase every trace of their existence from the universe. But first, he needed to understand them. He summoned his seers, his strategists, his intelligence officers. He demanded answers. How had the humans known about Vethkai shield frequencies? How had they developed weapons to counter Vethkai technology? How had they prepared so thoroughly for a war they should have known nothing about? The answer, when it came, was humbling. "They captured one of our probes," the chief intelligence officer reported. 23 years ago. They have been studying us ever since. They know our weapons, our tactics, our weaknesses. They have been preparing for this war longer than we realized." Seleth absorbed this information in silence. 23 years. A long time for humans. A eye blink for the Vethkai. But apparently it had been enough. "So they know us," he said finally. "They have learned our weaknesses. They have built weapons to exploit them." "Yes, High Arbiter." Seleth rose from his chair and walked to the window. Outside, the stars glittered in the eternal darkness. Somewhere out there, on a tiny blue world, a species was defying his empire. "It does not matter," he said quietly. "Knowledge cannot overcome power. Cleverness cannot defeat strength. The humans may have won these battles, but they cannot win the war. We have ships beyond counting. We have warriors beyond measure. We have resources they cannot imagine." He turned to face his officers, and his four eyes burned with cold determination. "Summon the core fleet, all of it, every ship, every soldier, every weapon. We will descend upon the human territory with the full might of the hegemony. We will not stop until their worlds are burning and their people are in chains." "And if they resist?" the intelligence officer asked. Seleth smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "Then we will kill them all, every last one. We will leave nothing behind but silence and ash. The galaxy will look upon what we do to them and remember why the hegemony is feared." The orders went out that night. Across the hegemony, ships began to move. Fleets assembled, Armies mobilized. The greatest military force the galaxy had ever seen began to gather. All of it pointed at one small corner of space. The full might of an empire that had ruled for 12,000 years was about to fall upon humanity. And far away, on a small blue world called Earth, Admiral Chen Wei-lin received the intelligence reports and knew that the real war was about to begin. She looked out her window at the night sky, at the stars that had always seemed so peaceful and so distant. "They're coming," she said softly. "All of them." She turned from the window and began to plan. The Vethkai thought their power made them invincible. They thought their numbers made them unstoppable. They thought their 12,000 years of conquest had taught them everything about war. They were wrong. Humanity had learned lessons too. Different lessons. Harder lessons. Lessons paid for in blood and fire throughout their long and violent history. The strong did not always win. Numbers did not always matter. And empires, no matter how old, no matter how powerful, could always fall. The Terran fleet would deploy soon, and when it did, the galaxy would learn what humanity was truly capable of. The Vethkai believed themselves untouchable. They were about to discover how wrong they were. Admiral Chen Wei-lin had never expected to see this day. She had spent 30 years preparing for it. 30 years of planning and building and training. 30 years of keeping secrets, of lying to the public, of working in the shadows to prepare humanity for a war most people didn't even know was coming. And now it was here. She stood on the bridge of the TFS Defiance, the flagship of the Terran Grand Fleet, and watched as ships emerged from hiding places throughout the solar system. They came from everywhere. From the asteroid belts where secret shipyards had been built into the rocks. From the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, where vast military complexes lay hidden beneath ice and stone. From the dark spaces between planets, where ships had been waiting in cold storage for years. 3,000 vessels, the largest fleet humanity had ever assembled, the product of 2 decades of desperate secret work. Chen was 62 years old, with gray hair cut short and eyes that had seen too much. She had been a young officer when Project Sentinel began, one of the first to learn the terrible truth about what waited in the darkness between the stars. She had risen through the ranks, driven by the knowledge that one day humanity would need people like her. That day had come. "Admiral, all fleet elements are reporting in." Commander Jackson, her executive officer, stood at her side with a tablet in his hands. "The Grand Fleet is at full strength, 3,047 combat-ready vessels." Chen nodded slowly. "What about the enemy?" "Intelligence reports indicate the Vethkai are massing at Kethros Prime, a system about 40 light-years from our territory. Current estimates suggest a fleet of approximately 40,000 warships." 40,000? Chen let the number hang in the air. 40,000 against 3,000. More than 13 to 1 odds. "Some of the other admirals are recommending a defensive strategy," Jackson continued. "Pull back to our core systems. Make them come to us. Use our orbital defenses to even the odds." Chen said nothing for a long moment. She understood the logic. From a purely military standpoint, defense made sense. Let the enemy overextend their supply lines. Make them fight on human terms. Use every advantage that territory provided. But she had studied the Vethkai. She knew how they thought. She knew what they would do if humanity tried to hide behind its defenses. They would burn everything, every colony, every station, every outpost. They would destroy world after world, killing billions of people until humanity was reduced to a handful of survivors huddling on Earth. And then they would come for Earth itself. Defense was not an option, not against an enemy like this. "No," Chen said finally. "We don't wait for them. We go to them." Jackson's eyes widened. "Admiral, with all due respect, attacking a force that outnumbers us 13 to 1? Would be suicide if we fought the way they expect us to." Chen turned to face him, and there was something fierce in her expression. "But we're not going to fight the way they expect. We're going to fight like humans." She walked to the main tactical display and called up a star chart. Kethros Prime appeared, highlighted in red, with the estimated positions of the enemy fleet marked around it. "The Vethkai have been fighting wars for 12,000 years, Chen said. In all that time, they've never lost. Do you know why? Jackson shook his head. Because every species they've fought has played by their rules. They line up their fleets in pretty formations. They exchange ceremonial challenges. They fight with honor and dignity. And then they die. Chen's fingers stabbed at the display. We're not going to do that. We're going to cheat. We're going to fight dirty. We're going to do things so unexpected, so unprecedented, that they won't know how to respond. What did you have in mind, Admiral? Chen smiled. It was the kind of smile that made her enemies nervous. We're going to jump our fleet directly into the middle of their formation. Point-blank range, maximum chaos. They won't be able to bring their numbers to bear because they'll be too busy trying not to hit each other. Jackson stared at her. That's insane. The collision risks alone are acceptable, Chen finished. We've run the simulations. We'll lose ships. Probably a lot of them. But the Vethkai will lose more. And more importantly, they'll lose their coordination, their command structure, their ability to fight as a unified force. She turned back to the display. The Vethkai fight like a machine. Everything is precise, organized, perfect. We're going to break that machine. We're going to turn their battle into a brawl. And humans are very good at brawling. Jackson was silent for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. When do we move? Immediately. Have all ship captains report to the command channel. I want everyone to know the plan. Every detail. Every contingency. If we're going to do something this crazy, everyone needs to understand exactly what they're doing and why. Yes, Admiral. As Jackson hurried to carry out her orders, Chen returned to the observation window and looked out at the fleet. Her fleet, humanity's last hope. The ships were ugly. There was no other word for it. They were angular, practical things, all armor and weapons and engines. No elegance, no artistry, just raw, brutal functionality. The Vethkai would have looked at them with contempt. They would have seen only primitives, only prey, only victims waiting to be conquered. But Chen knew better. She knew what these ships represented. Years of work, mountains of resources, the combined effort of every nation on Earth, working together in secret to build a force that could stand against the darkness. And more than that, she knew what the people inside those ships represented. Humans were strange creatures. They could be cruel and petty and selfish. They fought wars against each other over land and resources and ideas. They destroyed their own environment and drove other species to extinction. In many ways, they were their own worst enemies. But when they faced a common threat, something changed. Old hatreds faded. Differences were set aside. Humans came together with a unity and determination that could be terrifying to behold. The crew of every ship in this fleet knew what they were fighting for. Not for nations or ideologies, not for wealth or glory. They were fighting for survival, for their families, for the future of their entire species. That kind of motivation was worth 1,000 warships. Chen's thoughts were interrupted by the chime of an incoming communication. She turned to see the holographic image of a familiar face appearing beside her. General Marcus Stone, commander of the Terran Marine Corps, looked at her with a grim expression. Admiral, I understand we're going on the offensive. That's right. Your people ready? Stone nodded. As ready as we'll ever be. I've got 50,000 Marines loaded on transport ships and assault carriers. Best soldiers humanity has ever produced. Every one of them is a volunteer. Every one of them knows they might not come back. The boarding operations will be critical, Chen said. We need to take out their command ships. Cut off the head, and the body will fall. We'll get it done, Stone promised. My people have been training for this for years. Fighting in zero gravity, breaching hostile ships, taking on enemies in close quarters. The Vethkai won't know what hit them. Chen studied his face. Stone was a hard man, a career soldier who had fought in half a dozen conflicts before the Vethkai threat was even known. He had lost friends, lost soldiers, lost pieces of himself in those wars. But he had never faltered. General, I won't lie to you. The odds aren't good. We're going up against a force more than 10 times our size. A lot of your people aren't going to make it home. Stone's expression didn't change. I know. They know. We signed up for this anyway. Why? The question seemed to surprise him. He was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Because somebody has to, he said finally. Because if we don't fight, nobody will. Because our children and our grandchildren deserve a future that isn't spent in chains, serving alien masters. He paused and something like a smile crossed his face. And because I've seen what humans can do when their backs are against the wall. We've been through ice ages and plagues and world wars. We've survived things that should have wiped us out 100 times over. The Vethkai think they're unstoppable. They've never met anything like us. Chen nodded slowly. No, they haven't. Let's make sure they regret that. The fleet departed 3 hours later. 3,000 ships engaged their hyperspace drives simultaneously, creating a wave of distortion that rippled across the solar system. They vanished from human space, crossing the vast distances between stars in the blink of an eye. On Earth, people watched the sky and wondered. The government had finally told them the truth. Aliens were real, they were hostile, and humanity was going to war. Some people panicked, some people prayed, some people simply went about their lives, unable to process the enormity of what was happening. But many people did something else. They looked up at the stars, at the darkness where their fleet had vanished, and they hoped that all the preparation had been enough. They hoped that their soldiers and sailors would prevail. They hoped that somewhere out there, in the cold emptiness of space, humanity would find a way to survive. Admiral Chen sat alone in her quarters as the Defiance traveled through hyperspace. The journey to Kethros Prime would take several hours, and she knew she should rest. The battle ahead would demand everything she had, but sleep wouldn't come. She pulled out a photograph and looked at it. An old picture, faded with age, showing a young woman with 2 small children, her daughter and her grandchildren. They lived on a colony world called Haven, far from Earth, far from the front lines. But nowhere was truly safe. Not anymore. If the fleet failed, if the Vethkai won, the enemy would eventually find Haven. They would find every human world, and they would do what they had always done to the species that opposed them. Chen put the photograph away and stood up. She walked to the small window in her quarters and looked out at the swirling chaos of hyperspace. She was afraid. She could admit that to herself, here, alone, where no one could see. She was afraid of dying, afraid of failing, afraid of what would happen to her family, her people, her entire species if she made the wrong decisions in the battle to come. But fear was not the same as weakness. Fear could be used. It could sharpen the mind, focus the will, drive a person to fight harder than they ever thought possible. Chen had been afraid many times in her life. She had never let it stop her. She turned from the window and began to review the battle plan one more time. Every detail mattered. Every decision could mean the difference between victory and extinction. The Terran fleet would emerge from hyperspace directly inside the enemy formation. They would have perhaps 30 seconds of chaos before the Vethkai could react. In those 30 seconds, the first wave of kinetic weapons would be launched. Tens of thousands of tungsten rounds traveling at a significant fraction of light speed, targeted at the largest and most dangerous enemy vessels. Then the missile wave would follow. Nuclear-tipped warheads, antimatter weapons, everything humanity had developed to kill Vethkai ships. The goal was not to destroy the entire enemy fleet. That was impossible. The goal was to break their formation, sow confusion, and create openings for the second phase of the attack. The second phase was the marine boarding operations. Assault carriers would close with enemy command ships, the vessels where the Vethkai admirals and generals directed the battle. Marines in powered armor would breach the hulls and fight their way to the command centers. Kill the commanders, and the enemy fleet would lose its coordination. The third phase was survival. Once the initial attack was complete, the Terran fleet would have to fight its way out of the trap it had created. Ships would be lost. Maybe a lot of ships. But as long as enough survived, as long as the enemy fleet was crippled, the battle would be a victory. It was a desperate plan. Risky, dangerous, and dependent on 100 things going right. But it was the only plan that had any chance of working. Chen closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of quiet. She thought of her daughter, of her grandchildren, of all the people on all the worlds who were counting on her. Then she opened her eyes and went to prepare her fleet for battle. The Terran Grand Fleet emerged from hyperspace above Kethros Prime at exactly 600 hours, Galactic Standard Time. 40,000 Vethkai warships hung in perfect formation around the planet, their biocrystalline hulls glittering in the light of the local star. They had been waiting, gathering, preparing for the final assault on human space. They were not expecting the attack. Admiral Chen stood on the bridge of the Defiance and watched as her fleet materialized directly in the center of the enemy formation. All around her, Vethkai ships loomed like mountains, their hulls just kilometers away. "All ships," she said calmly into the fleet-wide channel. "Weapons free." 3,000 human warships opened fire simultaneously. The Battle of Kethros Prime had begun. The first seconds of the battle were pure chaos. Admiral Chen had planned for this. She had wargamed this moment 1,000 times in simulations and exercises, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. The Defiance shook as kinetic rounds streaked past, missing the hull by meters. The tactical display was a storm of contacts, so many that the computers struggled to track them all. Vethkai ships filled every direction, their massive forms blocking out the stars. And everywhere, fire. The human fleet's opening salvo was devastating. Tens of thousands of tungsten rounds, each one traveling at 12% of light speed, slammed into the Vethkai formation. The enemy's shields, even adjusted after the earlier battles, couldn't stop projectiles moving that fast. Ships died by the hundreds in the first 3 seconds. But the Vethkai were not helpless. Even caught by surprise, they responded with the discipline of warriors who had fought for millennia. Weapon systems activated, ships began to maneuver. Return fire filled the void with deadly energy. The TFS Valor, a destroyer off the Defiance's port bow, vanished in a flash of light as a Vethkai plasma lance cut it in half. The TFS Redemption took a hit to its engine section and began spinning out of control, crashing into an enemy cruiser and destroying both ships. Chen gripped the arms of her command chair and forced herself to stay calm. "Tactical status report." Commander Jackson's voice was tight with stress but steady. "Enemy formation is breaking up as planned. We've destroyed or disabled approximately 800 enemy vessels. Our losses are currently at 112. 112 ships gone in less than a minute, nearly 4% of the fleet, and the battle had barely begun. Launch the second wave," Chen ordered. "Missile barrage. Target their dreadnoughts." Across the fleet, missile tubes opened and spat death into the void. Thousands of warheads raced toward the largest Vethkai ships, their warheads primed and ready. High Arbiter Seleth Varantis stood on the bridge of the Undying Throne, watching his fleet die. He could not believe what he was seeing. The humans had jumped directly into the middle of his formation. No species had ever done such a thing. It was insane. It was suicide. It was impossible. And yet it was working. All around him, his officers scrambled to restore order. But the human attack had shattered the carefully coordinated command structure of the hegemony fleet. Ships were firing at random, some hitting their own allies in the confusion. The beautiful formations that had won 1,000 battles had dissolved into chaos. "Get me Fleet Admiral Kethos," Seleth shouted. "I need a damage assessment now." "High Arbiter, we cannot reach Admiral Kethos. His flagship, the Eternal Conquest, has been destroyed." Seleth's 4 eyes went wide. Kethos was dead. Impossible. He was one of the most experienced commanders in the hegemony. He couldn't be dead, but he was. And so were dozens of other senior officers, killed in the opening seconds of the battle before they even knew they were under attack. "Then get me someone," Seleth roared. "Anyone who can take command of this mess." Before anyone could respond, the bridge shook violently. Warning alarms screamed. A damage report appeared on the main display, showing a hole in the Undying Throne's outer hull. "Report," Seleth demanded. "We've been hit by a kinetic round, High Arbiter. Minor damage, but—" The officer hesitated. "High Arbiter, I'm detecting small craft approaching our position. Human ships. They appear to be boarding vessels." Boarding vessels? The humans were trying to board the Undying Throne? Seleth's shock transformed into fury. How dare they? How dare these primitives set foot on his flagship? He would show them. He would destroy them all. Send security teams to all entry points, he ordered. Kill anything that gets through the hull. General Marcus Stone felt the impact as his assault carrier latched onto the Undying Throne's hull. All around him, Marines in powered exoskeletons checked their weapons and prepared for combat. The exoskeletons were humanity's answer to Vethkai physical superiority. The alien warriors were stronger and faster than unaugmented humans. But a human in a powered suit could lift a car, punch through a wall, and shrug off weapons fire that would kill an unarmored soldier. "Listen up!" Stone's voice echoed through the carrier's troop bay. "We've drilled this 1,000 times. We breach the hull, we fight through to the command center. We kill anyone who gets in our way. The alien high command is on this ship. We take them out, and this battle is over." 500 Marines roared their acknowledgement. "Good! Breach teams, move out!" The cutting lasers activated, slicing through the alien hull like butter. Within seconds, a hole appeared, large enough for the exoskeletons to pass through. Atmosphere screamed out of the breach, carrying debris and anything not bolted down. Stone was the first one through. He emerged into a corridor of nightmares. The walls pulsed with organic matter, like the inside of a living creature. Strange fluids dripped from the ceiling. The air smelled of copper and something else, something alien and wrong. And waiting for him were the Vethkai warriors. They were tall, nearly 3 meters, with gray skin and ridged skulls and 4 gleaming eyes. They wore armor that seemed to grow from their bodies, carrying weapons that hummed with deadly energy. Stone raised his weapon and opened fire. The first Vethkai went down, its chest torn apart by high-velocity rounds. The second managed to get off a shot, the plasma bolt splashing against Stone's shoulder armor and leaving a scorch mark but not penetrating. Stone killed it with a burst to the head. Behind him, his Marines poured through the breach, their weapons roaring. The fighting in the corridors was brutal and close. The Vethkai were fierce warriors, genetically engineered for combat over thousands of years. But the humans had advantages of their own. Their weapons were designed specifically to penetrate Vethkai armor. Their exoskeletons gave them strength and protection that matched their enemies. And they had trained for exactly this kind of combat, spending years practicing boarding operations in close-quarters battle. More than that, they had something the Vethkai didn't understand: desperation. Every Marine in that corridor knew what was at stake. They knew that if they failed, if the Vethkai won, everyone they loved would be enslaved or killed. There was no surrender, no retreat, no second chance. They fought like they had nothing to lose, because they didn't. Stone led the advance through the ship, his rifle never stopping, his voice never wavering. He lost Marines at every intersection, good soldiers cut down by enemy fire. But more Vethkai fell, and the humans kept pushing forward. 30 minutes after the breach, they reached the command deck. On the bridge of the Defiance, Admiral Chen watched the battle unfold. It was going better than she had dared to hope. The initial strike had crippled the enemy command structure. The Vethkai were fighting as individual ships now, not as a coordinated fleet, and while they still vastly outnumbered the humans, they couldn't bring that advantage to bear. The human fleet had divided into hunting packs, groups of ships working together to isolate and destroy enemy vessels. It was not a clean or elegant style of warfare. It was brutal, messy, and costly, but it was working. "Admiral," Jackson reported, "General Stone's team has reached the command deck of the enemy flagship. They're about to breach." Chen nodded. "Put it on screen." A small window appeared on the tactical display, showing helmet camera footage from Stone's Marines. They were stacked up outside a massive door, the entrance to the Vethkai bridge. "Charges set," someone reported. "Ready to breach." Stone's voice came through clearly. "On my mark. 3, 2, 1. Mark." The door exploded inward. Stone charged through the smoke and fire, his Marines right behind him. The Vethkai bridge was enormous, a cathedral of organic technology filled with alien officers and crew. At the center, on a raised platform, stood a figure in elaborate robes, High Arbiter Seleth Varantis. Seleth raised a weapon, some kind of pistol that glowed with deadly energy. He fired at Stone, the blast striking the general's chest armor and staggering him backward. Stone stayed on his feet. His armor had held, barely. Around him, his Marines engaged the Vethkai bridge crew. Bodies fell on both sides. Blood of two different colors stained the floor. Stone advanced on Seleth, raising his rifle. The High Arbiter fired again and again. Each shot knocked Stone back, scorched his armor, came closer to finding a weak point. But Stone kept coming. 10 meters. 5 meters. Seleth's weapon ran dry. He looked at it in disbelief, then looked up at the human soldier standing before him. Stone leveled his rifle at Seleth's head. For a long moment, neither of them moved. "Go ahead," Seleth said. His voice was cold, defiant. "Kill me. It will change nothing. The hegemony will send more fleets, more warriors. We will hunt your species to extinction." Stone's finger tightened on the trigger. He wanted to fire. He wanted to end this creature, this monster who had ordered the deaths of countless billions across the galaxy. But he remembered his orders. "No," he said, "you don't get to die. You don't get to escape what's coming." He lowered his rifle and pulled a set of magnetic restraints from his belt. "High Arbiter Seleth Vorantis, by the authority of the Terran Defense Force, you are under arrest for crimes against sentient life. You will be transported to human space, where you will stand trial for your actions." Seleth stared at him in incomprehension. You are taking me prisoner? You are not going to kill me?" "We're not like you," Stone said. "That's the point." He slapped the restraints on Seleth's wrists and handed him off to two of his Marines. "General Stone to Admiral Chen," he spoke into his communicator. "Objective secured. The High Arbiter is in custody." On the bridge of the Defiance, Chen allowed herself a small smile. "All ships, this is Admiral Chen. The enemy command has been neutralized. Press the attack. Don't let up." The battle continued for another 6 hours, but its outcome was never really in doubt after that moment. Without their High Arbiter, without their senior commanders, the Vethkai fleet fell apart. Some ships continued to fight. Some tried to flee. Some simply stopped, their crews surrendering or abandoning ship. By the time the sun of Kethros Prime rose over the planet's horizon, it was over. The Terran fleet had lost nearly 800 ships. Thousands of sailors and Marines had died. It was the bloodiest day in human history, but the Vethkai had lost far more. Nearly 12,000 of their warships had been destroyed. Thousands more were crippled or captured. Their High Arbiter was in chains. Their fleet command was shattered. For the first time in 12,000 years, the hegemony had been truly defeated. Admiral Chen stood on the bridge of the Defiance and looked out at the field of wreckage that surrounded her. Pieces of ships, both human and Vethkai, drifted through the void. Small fires still burned on some of the hulks. Emergency beacons flashed in the darkness. It was a graveyard, a monument to the cost of war, but it was also a victory. Chen took a deep breath and opened a channel to the surviving ships. "This is Admiral Chen. What we have done today will be remembered for as long as humanity exists. We faced an enemy that had never been defeated, an empire that had crushed 1,000 species, and we broke them." She paused, looking at the faces of her bridge crew. They were exhausted, battered, grieving for lost friends. But there was something else in their eyes too. Pride. "We have paid a terrible price. We will mourn our dead. We will never forget their sacrifice. But because of what they gave, because of what all of you gave, humanity will survive. Our children will grow up free. Our species will have a future." She straightened her shoulders. "Secure the area. Search for survivors, ours and theirs. Prepare the fleet to return to human space." She paused one final time. "We're going home." Far away on 1,000 worlds, the subjugated chorus heard the news. For 12,000 years, they had been slaves. Entire species, billions upon billions of beings, forced to serve the Vethkai hegemony. They had no hope, no future, no possibility of freedom. And now, for the first time, everything had changed. A new species had risen, a species that fought back, a species that won, the humans. Across the galaxy, in slave camps and work colonies and prison worlds, beings of 100 different species looked up at the stars and felt something they had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. The hegemony was not invincible after all. The masters could be defeated, the chains could be broken, and maybe, just maybe, freedom was possible. The era of the Vethkai was ending. The era of humanity was about to begin. The Terran fleet returned home to a hero's welcome. On every human world, people gathered to watch the ships arrive. They crowded into public squares and parks and stadiums, their eyes fixed on the sky. They watched as the battered vessels descended through the atmosphere, their hulls scarred and burned, their numbers far fewer than when they had departed. And they cheered. They cheered until their throats were raw. They cheered with tears running down their faces. They cheered for the living and mourned for the dead, because both had given humanity something precious, a future. Admiral Chen Wei-lin stood on the observation deck of the Defiance as the ship descended toward Earth. Through the windows, she could see the blue and green of her homeworld growing larger and larger. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Admiral," Commander Jackson's voice was soft, "the planetary authorities are requesting that you address the people. They say everyone wants to hear from you." Chen shook her head. "Later. Right now, I need to see my family." She had spoken to her daughter briefly during the journey home, a hurried communication, full of tears and promises. But it wasn't enough. She needed to hold her grandchildren. She needed to feel their arms around her. She needed to remember what she had been fighting for. "Of course, Admiral. Your shuttle is ready." Chen nodded and turned to leave, but she paused at the door and looked back at Jackson. "You did good work out there, Commander. When this is all over, we should talk about your next posting." Jackson smiled. "I'd like that, Admiral." Chen walked through the corridors of her ship, past crew members who saluted as she passed. Some of them had tears in their eyes. Others just looked tired, exhausted down to their bones. But all of them were alive. They had survived. So many hadn't. She tried not to think about the final casualty reports. Nearly 20,000 dead. 20,000 sailors and Marines who had followed her into battle and never came home. 20,000 families who would receive folded flags and medals instead of their loved ones. The weight of it pressed down on her with every step. She had known when she planned the attack that the losses would be terrible. She had accepted it as the price of victory. But accepting something in theory was very different from living with it in reality. Those names would haunt her for the rest of her life. Her shuttle landed at a small airfield outside New Denver, where her daughter lived. Chen stepped out onto the tarmac and saw them waiting for her. Sarah, her daughter, tall and dark-haired and beautiful, and the children, Maya and Thomas, bouncing with excitement. She barely made it 3 steps before they crashed into her. "Grandma! Grandma!" Chen knelt down and wrapped her arms around both of them, holding them tight. The tears she had held back for weeks finally broke free. "I'm home," she whispered. "I'm home." Sarah joined the embrace, and for a long moment, the 4 of them just stood there on the tarmac, holding each other, not speaking. Finally, Maya pulled back and looked up at Chen with wide eyes. "Grandma, did you really beat the aliens?" Chen laughed through her tears. "Yes, sweetheart, we did." "Was it scary?" Chen considered the question. She could lie, tell the children that everything had been fine, that she had never been afraid. But that would be wrong. They deserved the truth. "Yes," she said, "it was very scary, but we did it anyway, because some things are worth being scared for." Thomas, who was 8 and very serious for his age, nodded solemnly. "The kids at school said you're a hero." "A lot of people are heroes," Chen said. "Not just me, everyone who fought, everyone who built the ships, everyone who stayed home and hoped and prayed. We all did this together." She stood up and took Sarah's hand. "Let's go home." The war was not over, of course. Even with the High Arbiter in custody and the hegemony fleet shattered, the conflict continued. The Vethkai hegemony was vast, spanning thousands of systems, and they had no intention of surrendering. But something fundamental had changed. In the weeks following the Battle of Kethros Prime, reports began to arrive from across the galaxy. Slave uprisings on a dozen worlds, rebellions in the outer territories of the hegemony, species that had been subjugated for centuries, suddenly finding the courage to fight back. The subjugated chorus was awakening. On Earth, the leaders of the Terran government gathered to discuss the situation. President Miyamoto sat at the head of the table, surrounded by generals and admirals and diplomats. "The question before us," he said, "is what to do next. We have won a great victory, but we have also started something that we may not be able to control. Admiral Chen, who had been asked to attend, spoke up. With respect, sir, we didn't start this. The Vethkai started it when they decided to conquer us. We're just the first species that fought back successfully. And now 100 other species are doing the same, said General Stone, who had been promoted after his heroics aboard the Undying Throne. The hegemony is facing wars on every front. They don't have the forces to crush all these rebellions and fight us at the same time. Secretary of State Martinez leaned forward. We've been receiving communications from some of these rebel groups. They want to know if we'll help them, if we'll support their fight for freedom. President Miyamoto rubbed his temples. So we go from fighting for our survival to fighting for the liberation of the galaxy? Maybe, Chen said. Or maybe we let them fight their own battles while we rebuild our strength. I won't pretend to know what the right answer is, but I do know this. We can't go back to the way things were. The galaxy knows about us now. Every species out there knows that humans defeated the hegemony. They're going to be watching to see what we do next. The discussion continued for hours. Some argued for caution, for consolidation, for building defenses and waiting to see how things developed. Others argued for action, for supporting the rebellions, for striking while the hegemony was weak. In the end, they reached a compromise. Humanity would focus on defense first, rebuilding its fleet and strengthening its borders. But they would also reach out to the rebel species, offering what help they could without overextending themselves. It was not a perfect solution, but perfect solutions rarely exist in the real world. The trial of High Arbiter Seleth Vorantis was held 6 months after the battle. It took place in Geneva, in a specially constructed courtroom that could accommodate the security requirements and the massive public interest. Billions of people across human space watched the proceedings, and the broadcasts were intercepted by species throughout the galaxy. Seleth was brought into the courtroom in chains, his once magnificent robes replaced by simple prisoner's clothing. He looked diminished somehow, smaller. The fierce light that had burned in his 4 eyes had faded to something cold and bitter. The charges were read: crimes against sentient life, genocide, enslavement, mass murder. The list went on for nearly an hour, documenting 12,000 years of Vethkai atrocities against countless species. When asked how he pleaded, Seleth laughed. Pleaded, he said, his voice echoing through the courtroom. You ask how I plead? I am the High Arbiter of the Vethkai hegemony. My ancestors ruled the stars before your species could even walk upright. I do not recognize this court. I do not recognize your authority. You are nothing but prey that has temporarily escaped its destiny. The judge, a stern woman named Justice Morrison, looked at him without expression. The defendant pleads not guilty. The trial will proceed. It took 3 months to present all the evidence. Witnesses from a dozen species testified about what the hegemony had done to their worlds. Documents were produced showing orders signed by Seleth himself, commanding the destruction of civilizations and the enslavement of billions. Seleth's defense was simple. He argued that the Vethkai had the right to do whatever they wished to inferior species. He argued that might made right, that the strong were entitled to rule the weak. He showed no remorse, no regret, no acknowledgement that what he had done was wrong. In the end, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was held a week later. Justice Morrison looked down at Seleth, her face grave. Seleth Vorantis, you have been found guilty of crimes so vast that they are almost beyond comprehension. Under normal circumstances, these crimes would warrant death. Seleth straightened slightly, as if preparing to receive his sentence with dignity. However, Morrison continued, the prosecution has requested, and this court has agreed, that death is not the appropriate punishment in this case. Seleth's eyes narrowed in confusion. Instead, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of release. You will spend your remaining years in a secure facility where you will be required to provide testimony for ongoing investigations into hegemony war crimes. You will watch as the empire you built crumbles. You will see your people brought to justice one by one. You will live long enough to know that everything you believed in, everything you fought for, has been destroyed. Morrison leaned forward. You wanted to be remembered as the High Arbiter who crushed humanity. Instead, you will be remembered as the tyrant who fell to a species you dismissed as prey. History will not be kind to you, Seleth Varantis, and you will have a long time to think about that. Seleth stared at her in silence for a long moment. Then, for the first time since his capture, his composure cracked. "This is not over," he hissed. "The hegemony will rise again. We will find new leaders, build new fleets. We will return, and when we do—" "When you do," Morrison interrupted, "we'll beat you again, and again, as many times as it takes. Because that's what humans do. We survive, we adapt, we win." She nodded to the guards. "Take the prisoner away." As Seleth was led out of the courtroom, he passed by Admiral Chen, who had been sitting in the gallery throughout the trial. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Chen saw hatred in those four alien eyes. Hatred and rage and a promise of vengeance. But she also saw something else. Something Seleth probably wasn't even aware of. Fear. He was afraid of humanity, afraid of what they had done and what they might do in the future. Afraid of a species that had faced impossible odds and refused to surrender. Good, Chen thought. Let him be afraid. Let all of them be afraid. The galaxy was changing. The old order, the order of the strong preying on the weak, was crumbling. In its place, something new was being born. Something better, and humanity would be at the heart of it. 5 years later, Chen stood on the observation deck of a space station orbiting a world called Sanctuary. The station was new, built as a meeting place for the growing alliance of free species. Representatives from dozens of races gathered here to coordinate their efforts against the remnants of the hegemony, to share resources and knowledge, to build a future where no species would have to live in fear. Chen had been appointed as humanity's ambassador to this alliance. It was a retirement job of sorts, a way to use her experience without the stress of military command. She had accepted it gratefully. The door behind her opened, and General Stone walked in. He had aged in the years since the war, his hair now completely gray, his face lined with the weight of everything he had seen and done. But his eyes were still sharp, and he still walked with the bearing of a soldier. "Ambassador," he said with a slight smile, "you wanted to see me?" "Just Chen Marcus. We've known each other too long for formality." Stone nodded and joined her at the window. Together they looked out at the planet below. "Sanctuary," Chen said. "Do you know who named it?" "Can't say I do. It was a child, a little girl from one of the first species to join the Alliance. Her people had been slaves for 800 years. She was born in a work camp and never knew anything but fear and suffering." Chen's voice was soft. "When she saw this planet for the first time, saw the green forests and the blue oceans, and knew that she was free, she said it looked like a sanctuary. The name stuck." Stone was quiet for a moment. "That's a good story. It's why we fought, Marcus. Not for glory or revenge or conquest. We fought so that little girls could grow up free, so that no one would ever have to live in fear of the hegemony again. Did we succeed?" Chen considered the question. The war was still going on in some places. The hegemony had not surrendered and probably never would. There would be more battles, more casualties, more grief. But the tide had turned. The empire that had ruled for 12,000 years was falling apart. The species they had enslaved were rising up. The darkness was receding. "I think so," she said finally. "Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. We showed the galaxy that bullies can be beaten, that hope is stronger than fear, that one species fighting for survival can change everything." She turned to face Stone. "The Vethkai thought they were untouchable. They thought their power made them invincible. They looked at us and saw prey." A smile crossed her face. "They were wrong." Outside the window, the stars glittered in the endless darkness. Somewhere out there, battles were being fought. Somewhere out there, people were dying. The universe was still a dangerous place, but it was also a place of hope now, a place where freedom was possible, a place where the weak could stand against the strong and win. Humanity had done that. They had paid a terrible price, but they had done it. And they would keep doing it for as long as it took, until the galaxy was finally free. The age of the hegemony was over. The age of humanity had begun. And across the stars, In camps and colonies and worlds beyond counting, the children of 100 species looked up at the sky and dreamed of tomorrow. Because tomorrow, for the first time in millennia, belonged to them.